A homeless man whispers to Morgan Freeman in a diner. What happens next shocks everyone. Do you remember me? The words were barely more than a whisper, but they froze Morgan Freeman in place. He had been enjoying a quiet evening in a diner, sipping his coffee, when a homeless man shuffled up to his table and leaned in close. What he said next would change everything. If you respect Morgan Freeman, comment 1. If you believe power and wealth can vanish overnight, comment 0. The streets of New York City buzzed with the usual late-night energy. Horns honking, neon signs flickering, steam rising from subway grates. But inside a small, rundown diner on the Lower East Side, the world felt quieter. The clinking of silverware, the occasional hiss of the coffee machine, and the murmurs of tired customers filled the dimly lit space. Morgan Freeman sat alone in a booth by the window, wearing a simple black coat and a gray scarf. It wasn't an expensive restaurant, nor was it the kind of place where celebrities dined. But that's exactly why he liked it. It was real. No cameras, no staged conversations. Just people living their lives. He lifted his coffee to his lips, savoring the warmth against the chill of the night, when he noticed him, a homeless man, wrapped in layers of tattered clothing, hunched in the corner of the diner. His beard was overgrown, his face marked by time and hardship. He wasn't begging. He wasn't causing trouble. He was just existing. The other customers ignored him, some out of discomfort, others out of habit. It was as if he were invisible, until he moved. Slowly, he stood, his legs unsteady, and shuffled toward Morgan's table. The room seemed to tense. A waitress glanced over, her grip tightening around the coffee pot. A man at the counter watched cautiously, as if expecting trouble. But Morgan Freeman? He didn't flinch. The man stopped beside the booth, his eyes scanning Morgan's face as if searching for something. Then, in a voice so soft, it was almost lost in the hum of the diner, he whispered, "Do you remember me?" Morgan set his coffee down, his deep brown eyes narrowing slightly. "Should I?" he asked, his voice as steady and rich as ever. The man's lips trembled. He took a shallow breath before answering. "I was once the man who directed you." The room went silent. What happened to this man? How could someone who once worked in Hollywood now be homeless? And why did he choose to approach Morgan Freeman? Keep listening. What happens next will change the way you see success forever. The diner was small, the kind of place that never made it into tourist guides, but had a certain charm that locals appreciated. The neon sign outside flickered faintly, casting a dull glow over the rain-slicked pavement. Inside, the air was warm, carrying the comforting scent of fresh coffee, sizzling bacon, and buttered toast. Morgan Freeman sat in a corner booth, his fingers wrapped around a steaming cup of black coffee. He had always liked places like this. Quiet, unpretentious, real. Places where people weren't trying to impress anyone, where life felt slower. After years in Hollywood, he had learned to cherish these moments of solitude where he could sit, observe, and simply exist without expectation. Tonight was one of those nights, or at least it was supposed to be. But then came the whisper, "Do you remember me?" It was soft, almost hesitant, but it cut through the low hum of conversation like a knife. Morgan lifted his gaze from his coffee and found himself staring into the eyes of a man whose face was both familiar and unrecognizable at the same time. The man standing before him was gaunt, his cheekbones sharp against his skin, his beard unkempt and speckled with gray. His clothes were layered, tattered jackets over sweatshirts, as if he had been braving the cold for too long. But it was his eyes that struck Morgan the most. There was something in them, something deep, something broken. Morgan's brow furrowed slightly. "Should I?" he asked, his voice low, steady. The man swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing. I was once the man who directed you." For a brief second, the words didn't register. Morgan stared at him, his mind working through the faces of the past, the voices, the memories. And then, like a puzzle falling into place, recognition dawned. The name slipped from his lips before he even realized he had spoken it. Daniel, the man, Daniel Coleman, gave a weak, almost embarrassed nod. Morgan sat back, exhaling sharply. He hadn't heard that name in nearly 2 decades. Daniel had once been one of the most promising directors in Hollywood, a visionary, a man people admired, respected, even feared at times. He had commanded sets with precision, brought stories to life with a clarity that few could match. And now, here he was, homeless. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The world around them carried on, orders being called from the kitchen, the clink of spoons against ceramic cups, the muffled chatter of late-night diners. But between them, silence stretched long and heavy. Morgan motioned to the seat across from him. "Sit." Daniel hesitated, his fingers twitching slightly. He glanced around as if expecting someone to throw him out, but no one did. The waitress behind the counter had been eyeing him suspiciously, but when she saw Morgan's calm expression, she backed off. Slowly, Daniel lowered himself into the seat, his movements stiff as though his body was not used to the luxury of sitting in a warm place. Morgan studied him for a long moment before finally speaking. "What happened?" Daniel let out a rough, breathy chuckle. "That's a long story." "I've got time," Daniel exhaled, rubbing his hands together as if trying to warm them. "You remember the last film I worked on?" Morgan nodded. "You were at the top of your game." Daniel gave a humorless laugh. "Yeah. And then I lost everything." Daniel's story came in slow, fragmented pieces, as if saying it aloud made it all too real. He had once been unstoppable, a director whose films were praised by critics and adored by audiences. He had worked with some of the biggest names in Hollywood, and his future had seemed limitless. But then came the scandal. A deal had gone wrong. A producer had accused him of misconduct, an accusation that, whether true or not, had been enough to destroy his reputation. The industry that once celebrated him had turned its back overnight. No one would hire him. Investors pulled out of his projects. Friends stopped returning his calls. One moment, he was a man with power, influence, and status. The next, he was untouchable. For a while, he tried to fight it. He spent his savings on legal battles, trying to clear his name. But Hollywood didn't wait. New talent replaced him, and soon he was forgotten. He lost his home, his family, his dignity. And once you hit rock bottom, Daniel murmured, people don't see you as a person anymore. You become invisible. Morgan felt a pang in his chest. He had seen this happen before. The industry could be cruel. It built people up, only to tear them down without hesitation. You never tried to come back? Morgan asked. Daniel gave a tired smile. Come back to what? No one was waiting for me. Morgan nodded slowly, letting the weight of Daniel's words settle. He could see it now. The man who had once commanded entire film sets with confidence now hunched over a diner table, speaking in a voice barely above a whisper. Morgan leaned forward, his voice quiet but firm. Do you still love it? Daniel blinked. What? Filmmaking, storytelling, do you still love it? Daniel let out a long breath. It doesn't matter. Morgan shook his head. Yes, it does. Daniel looked away. I'm not that man anymore. But you could be, Daniel scoffed, shaking his head. I'm a homeless man sitting in a diner with nothing but the clothes on my back. Who would ever give me a second chance?" Morgan's expression softened. "Maybe you don't need someone to give it to you. Maybe you just need to take it." Daniel let out a bitter laugh. "And how do I do that, Morgan? Walk into a studio and say, 'Hey, remember me?' They'd laugh me out of the building." Morgan was silent for a moment. Then he said something that made Daniel freeze. "Come work with me." Daniel's eyes snapped up. "What? I'm producing a documentary. No big budgets, no Hollywood politics, just storytelling. And I need someone who knows how to tell a damn good story." Daniel stared at him, his lips slightly parted, as if he couldn't believe what he had just heard. "You're serious?" Morgan nodded. "I don't believe that one mistake defines a man. And I don't believe that talent just disappears. You were one of the best, Daniel, and I think you still are." Daniel looked down at his hands. For the first time in years, he felt something stir inside him. Hope. Daniel thought his story was over, but Morgan Freeman just handed him a new chapter. Would Daniel take the chance? Or had the world already convinced him that he was beyond saving? What happens next will change everything. The diner's neon sign buzzed softly outside, its faded glow barely illuminating the damp streets of New York City. Inside, the warm hum of conversation, the distant clang of dishes, and the occasional hiss of a coffee pot filled the space. But at the small booth near the window, a different kind of energy hung in the air. A weighty, unspoken tension between two men from vastly different worlds. Morgan Freeman sat across from Daniel Coleman, a man he once knew as one of Hollywood's most promising directors, now reduced to a shadow of his former self. His clothes were worn, his beard overgrown, and his hands trembled slightly as he wrapped them around the hot cup of coffee Morgan had bought him. Daniel had once commanded entire film sets, guiding actors and crews with confidence. Now he sat hunched, shoulders curled inward, as if trying to make himself smaller, and yet the spark in his eyes hadn't completely died. "You don't get it, Morgan," Daniel muttered, staring down at the table. "It doesn't matter if you believe in me. The world already decided I wasn't worth believing in." Morgan stirred his coffee slowly, watching Daniel with his signature steady gaze. "And you let them decide that?" Daniel scoffed, shaking his head. "I didn't have a choice." Morgan leaned forward slightly. "There's always a choice, Daniel. Maybe not in what happens to us, but in how we respond." Daniel exhaled sharply. "And what would you have done, huh? If everything was taken from you? If the world stopped returning your calls? If your name became nothing but a whispered joke?" Morgan took a sip of his coffee before answering. "I would have kept talking even if no one was listening." Daniel let out a bitter laugh. "That's easy for you to say. You're Morgan Freeman. People listen when you talk." Morgan's voice softened. "Not always." Daniel blinked, thrown off by the honesty in Morgan's tone. "There were years," Morgan continued, "when no one wanted to hear my voice, when the only roles I could get were small, forgettable, when I was told to accept my place and not expect more. I was turned down for roles that I knew I was perfect for, but I didn't let their no become my final answer." Daniel's jaw tightened. "It's different for me. They didn't just turn me down. They erased me." Morgan studied him for a long moment before speaking. "And yet, here you are, sitting across from me, still breathing, still talking. So tell me, Daniel, do you really believe you're erased?" Daniel looked away. The silence between them stretched, filled with unspoken thoughts. "You know what the hardest part is?" Daniel finally said. Morgan waited. "It's not losing the money or the job or even the respect," Daniel continued. It's losing your identity. When you stop being someone and start being just another face on the street, people look through you like you don't exist. Morgan nodded slowly. I know what that feels like. Daniel gave a humorless chuckle. No offense, Morgan, but I doubt that. Morgan tilted his head. Why? Because I'm famous now. Daniel hesitated. Well, yeah. Morgan set his coffee down and laced his fingers together. Let me tell you something, Daniel. I spent most of my life on the outside looking in. Hollywood didn't roll out the red carpet for me. They didn't give me leading roles right away. I was passed over, ignored, told I was too old, too unknown, too something. Daniel frowned. But you didn't give up. Morgan smiled slightly. But I thought about it. Daniel's eyes flickered with something. Recognition, maybe even relief. Morgan continued. I know how easy it is to believe that once the world decides you don't matter, that's the end of the story. But the world doesn't get to write your final chapter, Daniel. You do. Daniel swallowed hard. Do you still love it? Morgan asked suddenly. Daniel blinked. What? Filmmaking. Storytelling. Do you still love it? Daniel's lips parted slightly, but no words came out. Morgan tilted his head. I think you do. I think, despite everything, it still burns inside you. But you've spent so long believing you don't have a right to it anymore that you've convinced yourself it's gone. Daniel clenched his fists on the table. Even if I did, it wouldn't change anything. No one's going to take a chance on me again. Morgan nodded. Then don't wait for them to. Daniel frowned. What does that mean? Morgan sat back, his deep voice unwavering. Who told you that you need permission to tell a story? Daniel opened his mouth, then shut it again. Morgan smiled knowingly. That's the problem, isn't it? You've been waiting for someone to allow you to create again. But the truth is, you don't need their permission. Daniel let out a sharp breath. I can't just walk into a studio and demand a film budget. Who said anything about a studio? Morgan countered. Daniel frowned. Then what? You want me to shoot a movie on my phone? Morgan chuckled. Maybe. Or maybe we start with something simpler. A documentary. A story about real people. Real struggles. Daniel was staring now, his heartbeat quickening. You were one of the best storytellers I knew, Morgan said, and you still are. That's something they can't take away from you, but you have to decide if you're willing to fight for it. Daniel let out a shaky laugh. You really think I can come back from this? Morgan nodded. I think you never actually left. You just forgot who you were. Daniel swallowed, his hands shaking slightly. But what if I fail? He asked. Voice barely above a whisper. Morgan's gaze was unwavering. Then you fail, and then you try again. Daniel exhaled, running a hand through his tangled hair. I don't even know where to start. Morgan smiled. Good thing I do. For the first time in years, Daniel felt something unfamiliar. Hope. It was small, fragile, but it was there. You really think this could work? He asked. Morgan simply lifted his coffee cup in a small toast. I think the only way to know is to try. Daniel let out a deep breath. Okay, he said. Morgan's smile widened slightly. Okay. As they sat there, the city continued outside, indifferent to the conversation happening in the small diner. But for Daniel, the world had just shifted in a way he hadn't thought possible. Maybe, just maybe, his story wasn't over yet. Daniel had taken the first step, but stepping back into the world he once ruled wouldn't be easy. What happens next will test him in ways he never expected. The rain had started again, tapping against the diner's window in soft, steady beats. Outside, the neon sign flickered, casting a faint red glow on the sidewalk. Inside, the hum of the city felt distant, almost muted, as if the world had narrowed to just the two men sitting across from each other in a booth that smelled faintly of burnt coffee and old vinyl. Daniel Coleman had once been at the top of his game, a celebrated director, a visionary, a man whose name carried weight in Hollywood. Now he sat across from Morgan Freeman, his fingers wrapped around a lukewarm coffee cup, his eyes clouded with doubt. Morgan had just given him an opportunity, a chance to reclaim a part of himself he thought was lost forever. But was he ready? Daniel let out a slow breath, staring down at the cracked surface of the table. "I don't know how to do this anymore." Morgan tilted his head slightly, considering him. "That's not true." Daniel let out a dry chuckle. "You sure?" "Because I feel like a fraud, like someone who used to be something but isn't anymore." Morgan's voice was calm, steady. "Then let me ask you something. When you wake up in the morning, do you still think in stories?" Daniel blinked, caught off guard. Morgan leaned forward. "Do you still see angles, shots, moments? Do you still hear dialogue in your head? Feel the rhythm of a scene before it even happens?" Daniel hesitated, but he couldn't lie. "Yeah, I do." Morgan nodded, as if that proved everything. "Then you're still a filmmaker. You just forgot for a while." Daniel exhaled sharply, shaking his head. "Even if that's true, I don't know where to start." Morgan lifted his coffee cup in a casual gesture. "Then let's start small." It wasn't glamorous. It wasn't a multi-million-dollar set with cameras and production assistants and craft services serving gourmet meals. It was a small community theater in Brooklyn, tucked away in an old building with peeling paint and a flickering marquee that hadn't been updated in years. And yet, when Daniel stepped inside, he felt something he hadn't felt in years. That hum of energy, the quiet excitement that always came before a performance, the feeling of stepping into a space where stories were told. Morgan had brought him here not as a spectator, but as a storyteller. "These are real people," Morgan said as they walked toward the back of the theater, past racks of old costumes and faded scripts. "They don't have big budgets, they don't have red carpets, but they have something real, and that's where we begin." Daniel rubbed a hand over his unshaven face. "And what exactly am I doing here?" Morgan smiled. "You're going to direct." Daniel stopped mid-step. "Wait, what?" Morgan chuckled. "You heard me. I pulled a few strings. The director of this play had to step away last minute. I told them you could help." Daniel blinked, his brain scrambling for an excuse. "Morgan, I can't just jump into this. I haven't directed anything in years. I don't even know these people. I don't even know what the play is about." Morgan's smile didn't waver. "So, figure it out." Daniel let out a sharp breath, running his hands through his graying hair. This was insane. He wasn't ready. He was barely keeping himself together. But then he heard it. The sound of actors rehearsing on stage, the shuffle of scripts, the way they stumbled over lines, searching for the rhythm of the dialogue, trying to find the truth in the words, and something in him woke up. He had done this 1,000 times before. He knew how to see the scene before it existed, how to shape a performance, how to bring out something real in people. He just had to trust himself again. Daniel let out a slow breath. "All right, let's do this." The first few minutes were awkward. The actors looked at him with skepticism, unsure why a stranger had suddenly appeared, giving them notes. Daniel stumbled a bit, his voice quieter than it used to be, his confidence rusty. But then, something shifted. The more he spoke, the more he found himself falling into rhythm. He pointed out where a pause was needed, suggested a different inflection on a line, told one of the actors to take a step forward instead of back. Small things, subtle things. And just like that, the scene came to life. He could feel it now. That old instinct, the ability to see the story before it existed, to know when a moment was working and when it wasn't. And for the first time in years, Daniel felt like himself again. Morgan watched from the back of the theater, a small smile playing on his lips. "You never lost it," he murmured under his breath. Hours passed. The rehearsal stretched late into the night, and when it finally ended, Daniel sat in the front row of the empty theater, exhausted but alive. Morgan sat down beside him, handing him a bottle of water. "You did good," Morgan said simply. Daniel took the bottle, twisting the cap off but not drinking. He stared at the stage, his mind still spinning. "It's crazy. I didn't even realize how much I missed this." Morgan nodded. "That's the thing about passion. It doesn't die. It just waits for you to come back to it." Daniel let out a tired chuckle. "You always talk like that?" Morgan smirked. "Only when people need to hear it." Daniel leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "What if this is as far as it goes? What if I never make it back?" Morgan was quiet for a moment, then said, "Let me ask you something. Did tonight feel like failure?" Daniel hesitated, then shook his head. "Number, it felt real." Morgan clapped him on the shoulder. "Then you're already back. You just have to keep moving forward." Daniel exhaled. He wasn't sure where this road was leading. He still had doubts, still had fears, but for the first time in years, he wasn't stuck. And that was something. Daniel had taken the first step, but stepping back into the world he once ruled wouldn't be easy. What happens next will test him in ways he never expected. The theater was empty now, the echoes of rehearsed lines and footsteps fading into silence. Daniel sat alone in the front row, staring at the stage where just hours ago he had rediscovered a part of himself he thought was lost forever. His hands rested loosely on his knees, his fingers tapping absent-mindedly as he let the moment settle in. Morgan Freeman sat down beside him, the quiet weight of his presence grounding Daniel in a way nothing else could. "You did good," Morgan said, his voice steady and sure. Daniel let out a small chuckle, shaking his head. "I don't know if I believe that yet." Morgan studied him for a moment before speaking. "Belief comes with time. What matters is you took the first step." Daniel exhaled, rubbing his hands together. "I spent years thinking I was done, that the world had closed its doors on me for good." He looked over at Morgan, his expression unreadable. "But maybe it wasn't the world that gave up on me. Maybe it was me." Morgan nodded slowly. "The hardest thing isn't falling. It's deciding to stand back up when no one is watching." Daniel swallowed hard, his throat tight with emotion. He had spent so long defining himself by what he had lost that he never considered what he still had. The knowledge, the passion, the ability to tell stories. That was something no scandal, no exile, no twist of fate could take from him. He looked up at the stage again, his mind no longer clouded by doubt, but by possibility. "I want to keep going," he said quietly. "Not just for me, but for the stories that still need to be told." Morgan smiled. "Then tell them." As they stood to leave, Morgan placed a hand on Daniel's shoulder. "You know, success comes and goes, but dignity, that's something you carry with you no matter where life takes you." Daniel nodded, his heart lighter than it had been in years, because for the first time in a long time, he wasn't just surviving, he was beginning again. Through this story, we realize that success is never permanent. but neither is failure. Daniel's journey teaches us that losing everything doesn't mean losing yourself. It's the choices you make after failure that define you. We learn that passion never truly dies. It only waits for us to embrace it again. Second chances exist, but only for those willing to take them. Most importantly, dignity is something no one can take from you unless you give it away. In the end, life isn't about never falling. It's about finding the strength to stand up again.